Chapter 13, Supply Chain, Preventive Controls for Human Food, presented by David Rosson. The safety of a food product depends on much more than just the hazards controlled within the production facility. Use of raw materials and other ingredients historically associated with a specific hazard may require a supply chain preventive control for that ingredient. In Subpart G of the Preventive Controls for Human Food, PCHF regulation, the two terms supply chain preventive control and supply chain program mean the same thing. Companies may have an extensive supplier program that encompasses much more than food safety elements, e.g., quality attributes to manage their supplier expectations and performance. This chapter focuses on the regulatory requirements for determining and conducting verification activities to ensure the supplier has implemented controls for the hazards the receiving facility has identified for the given ingredient. This chapter begins with a review of definitions of supplier, receiving facility, customer, and supply chain applied control as they apply to the PCHF regulation. It then discusses the required contents for a supply chain program under 21 CFR Part 117, Subpart G. This program will include development of supply chain preventive controls for those ingredients identified in the hazard analysis, which have supplier-controlled hazards. As part of the supplier preventive control, the company will implement appropriate supplier verification activities to ensure the adequacy of the supplier's control of the identified hazard. Record-keeping requirements for supply chain programs, disclosures, and customer written assurances also are discussed. For simplicity, the term ingredients may be used in place of the phrase raw materials and other ingredients used in the regulation. Definitions. Supplier: the establishment that manufactures, processes the food, raises the animal, or grows the food that is provided to a receiving facility without further manufacturing, processing by another establishment, except for further manufacturing, processing that consists solely of the addition of labeling or similar activity of a de minimis nature. 21 Code of Federal Regulations 117.3. Receiving facility: a facility that is subject to subparts C, preventive controls, and G, supply chain program, of this part, and that manufactures and processes a raw material or other ingredient that it receives from a supplier. 21 CFR 117.3. Customer: the commercial entity the receiving facility sells to, who may or may not be subject to the requirements for hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls, based on 21 CFR 117.136. A customer does not include consumer. Supply chain applied control: a preventive control for a hazard in a raw material or other ingredient, when the hazard in the raw material or other ingredient is controlled before its receipt. 21 CFR 117.3. To understand supply chain program requirements, it is important to understand the definition of supplier, receiving facility, and customer in the context of the regulation. Review the definitions in the text box and the illustration above. The manufacturer processor is the receiving facility for the raw material or other ingredient. The supplier may be a manufacturer or processor of the food that the facility receives. If the facility receives raw agricultural ingredients, the supplier is the entity that grows the food or raises the animal. For example, if a receiving facility receives a crop that is grown by Farmer Green, but is harvested and labeled by a regional harvesting organization, Farmer Green is still the supplier. Also note the definition of supplier in Part 117 means that a broker or distributor is not a supplier. The supplier is the establishment that manufactures, processes the food, raises the animal, or grows the food. Thus, if raw materials or other ingredients are purchased from a broker or distributor, a request is made to the broker or distributor to provide the necessary information to allow for the evaluation of the specific supplier that manufactures, processes the specific food, raises the animal, or grows the food as a supplier of the food. Likewise, if raw materials or other ingredients are purchased from a retail establishment, e.g. a warehouse-style establishment that sells to consumers, some applicable information, e.g. name and place of business of the manufacturer, packer, or distributor, would be on the product label as required by food labeling regulations in 21 CFR 101.5. Alternatively, the information may be requested from the retail establishment that allows for the evaluation of the supplier that manufactures, processes the food, raises the animal, or grows the food. The customer can be another manufacturer, processor, or an entity which prepares the food, such as a food service or retail establishment, or other type of operation. The customer may or may not be subject to the PCHF regulation. The hazard analysis process, discussed in Chapter 6, hazard analysis, determines when a hazard, requiring a supply chain applied control, exists. Some raw materials and other ingredients may not have hazards requiring a preventive control. For example, salt has not been associated with significant food safety issues. While a salt processor must operate under GMPs, conduct their own hazard analysis, and implement controls as necessary, a receiver of salt may conclude that a food safety hazard requiring a supply chain applied control is not present. The next slide illustrates how this could be documented in the hazard analysis. Other ingredients, however, do have an association with specific food safety hazards. A supply chain program is not needed when the receiving facility implements a preventive control for the hazard within the facility. For example, a pathogen is controlled by a validated cook step by the receiving facility. However, in some cases, the receiving facility relies on the supplier to control the hazard because the receiving facility cannot or will not control the hazard through its own manufacturing processing. In this case, a supply chain preventive control is required. If an ingredient has no identified hazards, that information can be documented in the hazard analysis, as shown in the e.g. Food Company. Example hazard analysis. In the evaluation of the ingredient salt, no hazard exists, and therefore no preventive controls would be needed relating to managing the food safety of this ingredient. Sourcing for this ingredient, as for all ingredients, may still be part of a company's overall supplier program. The hazard analysis for the e.g. Food Company identified salmonella as a hazard requiring a preventive control in the raw shell eggs they receive. E.g. Food Company will control the hazard using a process preventive control within their facility to prevent the hazards from causing illness to the consuming public. If e.g. Food Company purchased pasteurized in shell eggs instead of raw shell eggs, they could have used a supply chain preventive control instead of a process preventive control, since the supplier performs in shell pasteurization to control salmonella. This would require e.g. Food Company to verify that the controls at the supplier for pasteurization of the shell eggs are adequate to control the hazard on an ongoing basis. In both approaches described, the salmonella hazard can be effectively controlled to prevent illness. The e.g. Food Company decided to use a process preventive control for the salmonella hazard in raw shell eggs, instead of purchasing the more costly, pasteurized, and shell egg ingredient. For another example, e.g. Food Company chose a supply chain preventive control for the one biological hazard in sliced cheddar cheese. In this example, the hazard analysis concluded that refrigerated sliced cheddar cheese has the potential for recontamination with environmental pathogen, L. mono, at the supplier, so a supply chain applied control will be required. The e.g. Food Company does not have processes in place to control pathogens each cook step because the cheese is placed on the cooked omelet after the validated cooking step. The e.g. Food Company examples illustrate the flexibility that a company can use to ensure that hazards requiring a preventive control are controlled. Sometimes there are options, such as the previous shell egg examples, for the omelets. However, sometimes supply chain control is the best option, such as in the refrigerated sliced cheddar cheese example. A supply chain program is not required in the following situations. The hazard analysis concludes that there are no hazards requiring a supply chain applied control, or the facility controls the hazards requiring a preventive control within the facility, or the facility relies on their customer to control the hazard. The facility identifies for their customer that the food has not been processed to control the hazard. Reminder: there is enforcement discretion for the provision in the regulation regarding customer written assurances, which is discussed during the next slide. Example: Company A's hazard analysis determines salmonella is a hazard in raw nuts that they receive raw from a farmer, the supplier. Company A sorts and shells the nuts for their customer, who then roasts the nuts using a validated process. Company A is not required to apply a preventive control for salmonella if they disclose in documents accompanying the shipment that the nuts were not processed to control salmonella. The regulation establishes the requirements for when a receiving facility, manufacturer, processor elects to 1. Rely on their customer who is subject to the preventive controls regulation to control the identified hazard. 2. Rely on their customer who is not subject to the preventive controls regulation to manufacture, process, or prepare the food in accordance with applicable food safety requirements. Or 3. Rely on an entity in the distribution chain subsequent to the customer and the receiving facility to control the identified hazard. In all three situations, the receiving facility is required by the regulation to disclosure to the customer in documents accompanying the food, in accordance with the practice of the trade, that the food is not processed to control an identified hazard. The regulation also contains provisions for the receiving facility in Situation 1 to annually obtain from their customer a written assurance that the customer will control the identified hazard. In Situation 2, to annually obtain a written assurance the customer is manufacturing, processing, or preparing food in accordance with applicable food safety requirements. And in Situation 3, to annually obtain from the customer written assurance that the customer will disclose in documents accompanying the food that the food is not processed to control identified hazard and will only sell to another entity that agrees in writing to control the identified hazard if the entity is subject to the preventive controls regulation, or manufacture, process, or prepare the food in accordance with applicable food safety requirements if the entity is not subject to the preventive controls regulation. However, currently, all of these customer written assurances are under enforcement discretion. Enforcement discretion occurs when the FDA announces, via guidance to industry, that based on their current understanding of risks, they do not intend to enforce certain regulatory requirements as they currently apply to certain entities and/or activities. In general, the FDA exercises enforcement discretion to allow time to consider changes or other approaches to address concerns regarding the application of these provisions to certain activities or entities. Note that the stated discretion could change over time as FDA monitors the industry. So it is very important that the preventive controls qualified individual keep well informed of any potential regulatory developments. As discussed in the previous slide, when a receiving facility, manufacturer, processor identifies a hazard requiring a preventive control, identified hazard, does not control the identified hazard, and relies on an entity in its distribution chain to address the hazard, they must disclose information to their customers about foods that need control downstream to manage the identified hazard. As previously mentioned, the disclosures provision is in effect today and is enforceable by the FDA. The FDA issued guidance describing disclosure documents that must accompany the food. According to FDA, such disclosure needs to be made in documents that accompany the food, in accordance with the practice of the trade, such as labels, bill of lading, shipments, specific certificates of analysis, etc., since it would be expected that the customer is likely to read these documents. Since it is important that this information be well understood, placing it on a website is not sufficient. The FDA guidance does not recommend other contractual documents, since such documents generally are not specific to a particular shipment, and some of these documents may not be available to the customer's food safety manager. Further information may be found in FDA's guidance, Draft Guidance for Industry, describing a hazard that needs control, in documents accompanying the food, as required by 4 rules, implementing the FDA Food Safety Modernization Act. In this diagram, a wheat flour miller supplies raw flour to a facility that manufactures raw dough, who in turn supplies their customer, who is a baker that uses the dough in baked items. The raw dough manufacturer's hazard analysis determines salmonella is a hazard in raw flour received from a wheat miller, the supplier. The raw dough manufacturer has received the disclosure from the wheat flour miller that accompanies the shipment that the wheat flour has not been processed to control salmonella. The raw dough manufacturer, the receiving facility, combines the flour with other ingredients to make raw dough. The raw dough manufacturer is not required to apply preventive control for salmonella, since they rely on their customer to control the hazard. The raw dough manufacturer discloses in the bill of lading documents accompanying the shipment to the bakery customer that the dough was not processed to control salmonella. The bakery customer has been advised of the hazard and controls the hazard in their facility, such as by baking the dough into a baked item. 2 additional situations where the supply chain program requirements do not apply are: 1. When the receiving facility is an importer in compliance with the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, FSVP, regulation requirements, and 2. When the food is supplied for research or evaluation use. Per Section 117.405(2), a receiving facility that is an importer in compliance with FSVP requirements already has documentation that provides assurance that the hazards requiring a supply chain applied control have been significantly minimized or prevented, per Section 117.405(3). Food that is supplied for research or evaluation use is not subject to supply chain program requirements, provided that The food is not intended for retail sale and is not sold or distributed to the public. The food is labeled food for research or evaluation use. The food is supplied in a small quantity consistent with a research, analysis, or quality assurance purpose. It is used only for that purpose, and unused food is properly disposed of. And the food is accompanied with documents stating that it will be used for research or evaluation purposes and cannot be sold or distributed to the public. If applicable to the receiving facility, see the Foreign Supplier Verification Program requirements on FDA's website. See the FSPCA website for information on the FSPCA Foreign Supplier Verification Training. General requirements for the supply chain program. When a hazard requiring a supply chain applied control is identified, are listed above 1 to 4. The facility must 1. Approve suppliers for these ingredients for which a supplier has applied the control for a hazard. 2. Determine the appropriate supplier verification activities that the facility will use to verify that the supplier is applying appropriate controls for the hazards identified. 3. Conduct the supplier verification activities identified in Step 2. And 4. Ensure that these activities are documented. These activities will vary depending on the food, the hazards, and the facility's food safety system. Each of these requirements will be discussed in more detail in subsequent pages. In some situations, the supply chain applied control may be conducted by an entity other than the facility's direct supplier. For example, aflatoxin is a hazard associated with field corn. A milling company may have an aflatoxin control program for the dried corn they receive. A baking mix company may conduct verification activities at the miller to ensure that aflatoxin is controlled. To receive cornbread muffin mix, the receiving employee may verify the documentation from the baking mix company on their program for the miller. Another example of this situation could be where the farm that grows whole lettuce heads is the supplier because it's the grower, but a contract harvester is the entity that harvests and then distributes that lettuce to the receiving facility. The receiving facility that is using the whole lettuce as a ready-to-eat ingredient in its fresh-cut salad kit would need to conduct supplier verification activities of the lettuce supplier, the farm that grew the lettuce, to verify that it is controlling the pathogens, as well as verify that the contract harvester followed sanitary practices during harvesting to minimize pathogen cross-contamination, even though the harvester is not a supplier as defined in Section 117.3. A complete supply chain program must cover not just the immediate direct supplier, but also entities that handle the product in ways that may impact the safety of the food. Using approved suppliers. From a regulatory perspective, the use of approved suppliers applies to raw materials or other ingredients, where the hazard analysis identifies hazards requiring preventive control, and the facility identifies that the hazard will be controlled by the supplier. The regulation in Section 117.420A requires the receiving facility to approve suppliers and document that approval before receiving raw material and other ingredient. However, in Section 117.420B2, sourcing from an unapproved supplier on a temporary basis is permitted, provided that adequate supplier verification activities are performed before accepting the food for use. See upcoming slide 21, receiving from approved suppliers. The purpose of supplier verification activities is to ensure that hazards that must be controlled before receipt are in fact controlled. Under Subpart G, suppliers must be approved, and this approval must be documented before receiving raw materials. Section 117.420A specifies the receiving facility must approve suppliers in accordance with the requirements of 117.410D and document that approval before receiving raw materials and other ingredients received from those suppliers. Section 117.410D states that in approving suppliers and determining the appropriate supplier verification activities and the frequency with which they are conducted, the following must be considered. The hazard analysis of the food, including the nature of the hazard controlled, before receipt of the raw material or other ingredient, applicable to the raw material or other ingredient. The entity or entities that will be applying controls for hazards requiring a supply chain applied control, supplier performance, and IVs. Any other factors as appropriate or necessary, such as storage and transportation practices. As stated in the previous slide, considerations for approving a supplier include an evaluation of a supplier's performance. Section 117.41D13 outlines the supplier performance considerations, including an analysis of the supplier's own procedures, processes, and practices related to food safety of the raw material and other ingredients. This can include an adequate review of the supplier's food safety plan and environmental monitoring program, especially for a supplier of ready-to-eat ingredients that are exposed to the environment. Evaluating the supplier's ongoing compliance with applicable FDA food safety regulations. This can include reviewing inspection results and the supplier's history, if any, of warning letters, import alerts, and recalls, and evaluating the food safety history relevant to the raw material or other ingredients that the receiving facility receives from the supplier, including results from testing raw materials and other ingredients for hazards, audit results relating to the safety of the food, and responsiveness of the supplier in correcting problems. As stated in the previous slide, considerations for approving a supplier include an evaluation of a supplier's performance. Section 117.41D13 outlines the supplier performance considerations, including an analysis of the supplier's own procedures, processes, and practices related to food safety of the raw material and other ingredients. This can include an adequate review of the supplier's food safety plan and environmental monitoring program, especially for a supplier of ready-to-eat ingredients that are exposed to the environment. Evaluating the supplier's ongoing compliance with applicable FDA food safety regulations. This can include reviewing inspection results and the supplier's history, if any, of warning letters, import alerts, and recalls, and evaluating the food safety history relevant to the raw material or other ingredients that the receiving facility receives from the supplier, including results from testing raw materials and other ingredients for hazards, audit results relating to the safety of the food, and responsiveness of the supplier in correcting problems. The FDA created the data dashboard to summarize compliance information for specific firms, including information about domestic and foreign inspections, including top 10 citations, compliance actions, e.g. warning letters, recalls, and facts about imports such as summary information, refusals, and entry data. The goal is to increase transparency and accountability by displaying and allowing the analysis of public FDA data through easy-to-use, visually accessible, customizable, and understandable graphics. The FDA Firm Supplier Evaluation Resources database can be used to assess a specific supplier's compliance history by searching the supplier's firm name or FDA Establishment Identifier (FEI) number, if available. This may be helpful information to assess a supplier's regulatory compliance history. Written procedures must be established for receiving raw materials and other ingredients, specifically for those ingredients where a supply chain preventive control was applied. These procedures are generally established by the receiving facility. The use of written procedures for receiving raw materials and other ingredients is particularly important if an entity other than the receiving facility, such as an entity, is acting as an intermediary. In this circumstance, a written procedure is appropriate to ensure robust and meaningful verification has occurred. When purchasing from a broker or distributor, approval of the suppliers of the raw materials or other ingredients purchased must still take place. The broker-distributor can provide the documentation demonstrating written procedures are being followed to ensure that the raw materials and other ingredients provided only come from suppliers that have been approved. The broker-distributor would provide this documentation for review and assessment according to the food safety plan. For example, the documentation required may accompany the ingredient shipment when a broker-distributor has been tasked with ensuring raw materials or other ingredients are only coming from the approved supplier facility. There should be an agreement between parties on what procedures the broker-distributor will use to document this. For example, the broker-distributor could have a checklist that an employee dates and initials after reviewing the invoice from the supplier and sends a copy of that dated checklist to the facility, together with the invoice for the raw materials or other ingredients. The facility could use an electronic system or specific supply chain management software to document receipt of the raw material or other ingredient and review of checklist from the broker distributor at the time of receipt. The regulation specifies the requirements for receiving procedures regarding approved suppliers. Such procedures must be established and followed. The receiving facility must ensure that raw materials are only received from approved suppliers, or, under certain temporary circumstances, unapproved suppliers, and be documented. Receiving procedures must be specific to the producing facility supplier and the raw material or other ingredient being purchased. Shown here is an example of a receiving procedure for sliced cheddar cheese at E.G. Food Company. In this instance, the supplier controls the hazard, so each delivery of this ingredient needs to be verified to have come from the specifically approved supplier. Note that the approval relates to the specific location of Pcqi Co., located in Cowtown, USA, so that the review procedure must ensure that this cheese is sourced from this specific location. Determine appropriate supplier. Verification activities. Under 21 CFR 117.415A3, an entity other than the receiving facility may determine the appropriate supplier verification activities, provided that the receiving facility reviews and assesses the entity's applicable documentation and then documents the review and assessment. However, 117.415B1 stipulates that receiving facility may not accept a supplier's own determination of which verification activities are appropriate. Once approved suppliers are identified, the facility must determine and conduct appropriate verification activities to ensure that the supplier is controlling the hazard, requiring a supply chain applied control Verification is usually not conducted at the same frequency as monitoring activities, as discussed in more detail in Chapter 9, Process Preventive Controls, Monitoring and Corrective Action. Typically, verification is conducted after the fact as a check that the system is operating according to the plan. While some verification activities are performed for each lot, e.g. review of suppliers' in-house preventive controls, monitoring records, other supplier verification activities could be performed annually, such as an audit. When determining the appropriate supplier verification activities and the frequency with which the activities are conducted, the following must be considered: the nature of the hazard, who controls the hazard, e.g. supplier, and supplier performance. Appropriate supplier verification activities listed are cited in Section 117.410b. One or more of the following verification activities must be conducted for each supplier before initial use and periodically thereafter for ingredients that require a supply chain applied control. On-site audits. An on-site audit of food safety practices must be performed by a qualified auditor. Sampling and testing of the raw material or other ingredient. This means testing the supplier's raw material or other ingredient for the identified hazard of concern. A review of the supplier's relevant food safety records, e.g. processing times and temperatures, and other appropriate supplier verification activities based on the risk associated with the ingredient and the supplier, e.g. supplier questionnaires. The extent to which any of these activities are used must be risk-based and consistent with regulatory requirements. Each of these verification activities will be discussed in more detail later in this chapter. Let's look at an important definition. Verification: the application of methods, procedures, tests, and other evaluations, in addition to monitoring, to determine whether a control measure or combination of control measures is or has been operating as intended, and to establish the validity of the food safety plan. 21 CFR 117.3. The verification activities used and their frequency depends on the specific situation. The PCHF regulation requires consideration of the above in determining relevant verification activities. For example, consider the severity of the hazard. If the hazard is a serious hazard, e.g. salmonella in a ready-to-eat food, the regulation expects an annual audit. See definition for a serious hazard in Appendix 8. Definitions: where a preventive control is applied, e.g. at the supplier or at the supplier's supplier, may also impact verification procedures. For example, aflatoxin may be a hazard requiring a preventive control in cornmeal. The most effective controls for aflatoxin are applied at the farm during production, harvest, and storage of the corn prior to milling. Since the preventive control is applied by the farm, the supplier's supplier, the miller, the supplier, could conduct sampling and testing for aflatoxin of the cornmeal as a verification activity, and the results could be reported in a certificate of analysis to the receiving facility, company using the cornmeal and food product. Knowledge of the facility's supplier's procedures, processes, and practices related to food safety may also influence verification procedures. For example, a supplier that produces only peanuts would not be a major concern for non-peanut allergens because it only handles peanuts. However, a supplier that makes a variety of nut products with different kinds of nuts may present a higher risk of cross-contact because tree nuts of different varieties have different allergens present. Understanding how such a company controls allergens may be important to the facility's supply chain program. Another consideration is a supplier's compliance history with FDA regulations. Warning letters and import alerts for a supplier may warrant taking extra precautions to verify that adequate controls are in place. Country of origin may be a consideration as well. An ongoing relationship with the supplier is another important consideration. Some suppliers may have demonstrated many years of consistent performance, which may reduce the frequency necessary for the verification activity. Conversely, the need to constantly switch suppliers for an ingredient requiring supply chain applied control may warrant heightened verification activity to establish a supplier's ability to consistently meet the facility's food safety requirements. A supplier's response with corrective actions, when necessary, can also impact verification considerations. There may be other factors to consider, such as transportation and storage methods used by the supplier, e.g., when a food requires refrigeration for safety. Considerations for determining the appropriate supplier verification activities are the same as those for approving suppliers. 21 CFR 117410D1. A receiving facility does not need to conduct supplier verification for very small businesses, e.g., qualified facility, farms that grow produce and are not covered under the Standards for Produce Safety Regulation 21 CFR Part 112, or shell egg producers not subject to 21 CFR Part 118 because they have less than 3,000 laying hens. However, the receiving facility is still obligated to approve these small suppliers by evaluating the supplier's regulatory compliance history as required by Section 117.410 D113B. The receiving facility must obtain written assurance that the supplier retains its regulatory status before approving the supplier and annually thereafter by December 31st of each calendar year for the following calendar year, and obtains written assurance at least every 2 years that the supplier is producing the raw materials and other ingredients in compliance with applicable FDA food safety regulations. Qualified facility. Supplier assurance that they are producing the raw materials and other ingredients in compliance with applicable FDA food safety regulations, or, when applicable, relevant laws and regulations of a country whose food safety system FDA has officially recognized as comparable or as determined to be equivalent to that of the United States. Farms that grow produce and are not a covered farm under Part 112. Assurance that the farm acknowledges that its food is subject to Section 402 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or, when applicable, that its food is subject to relevant laws and regulations of a country whose food safety system FDA has officially recognized as comparable or has determined to be equivalent to the of the United States. Shell egg producer that is not subject to the requirements of Part 118, 3,000 laying hens. Assurance that the shell egg producer acknowledges that its food is subject to Section 402 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or, when applicable, that its food is subject to relevant laws and regulations of a country whose food safety system, FDA, has officially recognized as comparable or has determined to be equivalent to the of the United States. The receiving facility must obtain written assurance that the supplier retains its regulatory status before approving the supplier for an applicable calendar year, and annually thereafter by December 31st of each calendar year, and obtain written assurance at least every 2 years that the supplier is producing the raw material or other ingredient in compliance with applicable FDA food safety regulations. Conduct supplier verification activities. Only the receiving facility can approve suppliers. However, an entity other than the receiving facility may conduct supplier verification activities, provided that the receiving facility reviews and assesses the entity's applicable documentation, and then documents that review and assessment. Per 21 CFR 117.41504, the supplier may conduct and document sampling and testing of raw materials and other ingredients for hazards controlled by the supplier as a supplier verification activity for a particular lot of product and provide such documentation to the receiving facility, provided that the receiving facility reviews and assesses that documentation and documents that review and assessment. However, the facility cannot rely on a supplier's determination of appropriate verification activities for its own product. The facility needs to determine appropriate verification activities that are consistent with the food that the facility is producing. Thus, test results from a supplier are only acceptable if the facility has determined this is an appropriate verification activity for that food. Per 21 CFR 117415B2 of the regulation states, a receiving facility may not accept an audit conducted by its supplier. However, the regulation requirements do not prohibit a receiving facility from relying on an audit provided by its supplier when the audit of the supplier was conducted by a third-party qualified auditor in accordance with Section 117.430F and Section 117.435. A supplier's review of their own relevant food safety records cannot be accepted as an appropriate supplier verification activity per Section 117.415B3. As noted previously, another entity, such as a broker, may perform supplier verification activities, provided that the receiving facility reviews and assesses the entity's applicable documentation and documents that review and assessment. Remember, the supplier is the entity that manufactures the product, grows the food, or raises the animal. Thus, a broker is not a supplier in regulatory terms. When a hazard in a raw material or other ingredient will be controlled by the supplier and is one for which there is a reasonable probability that exposure to the hazard will result in serious adverse health consequences or death to humans, the appropriate supplier verification activity is an on-site audit of the supplier. The audit must be conducted before using the raw material or other ingredient from the supplier, and at least annually thereafter. A few serious hazard examples cited in the FDA hazard guide are salmonella in peanut butter, Clostridium botulinum toxin in underprocessed canned chili, Listeria monocytogenes in smoked salmon, undeclared peanut allergen in ice cream that did not declare peanut-derived ingredients but contained peanut butter as an ingredient, and choking hazards posed by a food for a baby. The regulation allows for an exception for annual audits, provided there is written determination that other verification activities and/or less frequent on-site auditing of the supplier will provide adequate assurance that the hazards are controlled. The receiving facility may be able to provide documentation that suggests why less frequent auditing is adequate to assure that controls are in place. For example, based on the facility's supplier's performance history, the facility may be able to demonstrate that an audit every 2 years combined with periodic testing provides adequate assurance that the supplier is controlling the hazard. Audit documentation requirements are outlined in Slide 40. While there is no official list of serious hazards, i.e., that will result in serious adverse health consequences or death to humans or animals, SACODA, the FDA draft guidance for industry, Q&As, regarding the reportable food registry. RFR identifies some circumstances of Class 1 recall situations that would be considered a reportable food. An article of food for which there is a reasonable probability that the use of or exposure to such article of food will cause serious adverse health consequences or death to humans or animals. See Appendix 8. Definitions for more information. The audit must be performed by a qualified auditor who has technical expertise to adequately review the supplier's food safety plan, or HACCP plan, if any, for the specific raw material or other ingredient to ensure that the hazard requiring a supply chain applied control is being significantly minimized or prevented. The audit would ensure that the appropriate hazards have been identified, the hazards are controlled, and documentation is available to show the hazard was controlled. The audit should include not only a review of the documentation, but also observation of operational practices. The auditor must ensure that the audit focuses on the specific product and the hazards is identified by the receiving facility. A receiving facility may not accept an audit conducted by its supplier per section 117.415b2. Note that section 117.415c states the requirements of this section do not prohibit a receiving facility from relying on an audit provided by its supplier when the audit of the supplier was conducted by a third-party qualified auditor in accordance with section 117.430F and section 117.435. A third-party audit is conducted by someone other than the supplier or the customer. It is important to note that the audited facility is still responsible for the audit outcome and addressing any concerns found during the audit. The supplier may provide a third-party audit to a receiving facility for review. Some companies use their own qualified employees to audit suppliers, a second-party audit. Such audits allow first-hand review of the critical food safety programs and preventive controls in place at the site. The qualified employee can obtain a sense for how effective programs are by diligently reviewing program records, observing activities, and interviewing line workers. While this type of audit allows a company to verify that their specific requirements are being met, it requires internal resources and expertise that may not be feasible for some companies. Some suppliers are routinely inspected by the FDA or other recognized regulatory agencies. A receiving facility may rely on the results of regulatory inspections instead of a third-party audit. A receiving facility may obtain information on inspections annually from the supplier. Keep in mind that government inspections may not occur annually, and the scope of the inspection may not include the receiving facility's specific raw materials or other ingredients and/or identified hazards. Section 117.435C1 states that the following may be substituted for an on-site audit, provided that the inspection must be conducted within 1 year of the date that the on-site audit would have been required to be conducted. I. The written results of an appropriate inspection of the supplier for compliance with applicable FDA food safety regulations by FDA, by representatives of other federal agencies, such as the United States Department of Agriculture, or by representatives of state, local, e.g. county, city, regional, tribal, or territorial agencies, or right. For a foreign supplier, the written results of an inspection by FDA or the Food Safety Authority of a country whose food safety system FDA has officially recognized as comparable or had determined to be equivalent to that of the United States. Section 117.435C2 further states for inspections conducted by the Food Safety Authority of a country whose food safety system the FDA has officially recognized as comparable or determined to be equivalent, the food that is subject of the on-site audit must be within the scope of the official recognition or equivalence determination, and the foreign supplier must be in and under the regulatory oversight of such country. Per Section 117.435b, if the raw material or other ingredient at the supplier is subject to one or more FDA food safety regulations, an on-site audit must consider such regulations and include a review of the supplier's written plan, e.g. HACCP plan or other food safety plan, if any, and its implementation for the hazard being controlled, or, when applicable, an on-site audit may consider relevant laws and regulations of a country whose food safety system, FDA, has officially recognized as comparable or has determined to be equivalent to that of the United States. Chapter 15 of the FDA Hazard Guide is a resource that discusses considerations for conducting an on-site audit. Because FDA food safety regulations vary in scope and detail based on the product, the parameters and key components of an on-site audit conducted under Section 21, CFR 117.435A would vary depending on what regulations apply to the supplier. A supplier that is subject to the PCHF requirements must have a food safety plan. See 21 CFR 117.126 for more detail. If a supplier is subject to the PCHF requirements, the on-site audit would focus on the supplier's food safety. This is a continuation of Slide 31 plan and assess the implementation of the preventive controls applied by the supplier to address the known or reasonably foreseeable hazards that the facility has determined to require a supply chain applied control. For example, before the facility obtains roasted peanuts, for which the facility has identified salmonella as a hazard from a supplier subject to the PCHF requirements, the facility would audit the supplier or obtain documentation of an audit performed by a third party to determine whether the supplier's roasting process adequately controlled the salmonella hazard. Because the supplier was subject to the PCHF requirements, the audit should include a review of the supplier's food safety plan. The auditor should review whether the roasting process had been validated to significantly minimize salmonella in peanuts and should examine whether the supplier had implemented the roasting procedures in accordance with its food safety plan. H. Through observing the establishment's procedures and reviewing records. A supplier that is not subject to the PCHF requirements, but is subject to HACCP requirements, would have a HACCP plan rather than a food safety plan, and therefore an audit of such a supplier would include a review of their HACCP plan or written plan and their implementation of the plan to assure hazards are controlled by the supplier. The Produce Safety Regulation in 21 CFR Part 112 does not require farms that are subject to that regulation to have food safety plans. If the farm does not have a food safety plan, then the audit would be performed to assure compliance with the Produce Safety Regulation provisions. However, in some cases, a supplier, such as a large farming operation, might voluntarily elect to establish a food safety plan. In that case, the on-site audit of the supplier should include a review of the supplier's written plan and its implementation of the plan to ensure that identified hazards are being adequately controlled. An audit of a supplier should include both a records review and observation of practices to obtain a complete picture of the safety of the supplier's operations. Comprehensive systems audits that include records reviews are more likely to reflect conditions throughout the year than an audit focused only on the state of the facility at the time of the audit. An audit of a manufacturing processing facility subject to the PCF requirements should address process, allergen, sanitation, and supply chain applied controls, if any, as well as GMPs, if applicable, and the specific hazards identified in the receiving facility's hazard analysis of the food. Let's look at an important definition. Qualified auditor, a person who is a qualified individual, as defined by this part, and has technical expertise obtained through education, training, or experience, or a combination thereof, necessary to perform the auditing function, required by 117.180C2. Examples of qualified auditors include 1. A government employee, including a foreign government employee, and 2. An audit agent of a certification body that is accredited in accordance with regulations of Part 1, Subpart M of this chapter, 21 CFR 117.3 definitions. The regulation states that as part of the receiving facility's verification activity for the supplier may conduct and document sampling and testing of raw materials and other ingredients for that supplier-controlled hazard, but the receiving facility must review and assess that documentation. This review and assessment must be documented. Testing of in-process materials, environmental samples, or the finished food produced by the supplier, either at the supplier's facility, at an outside laboratory, or in the receiving facility, may be appropriate if such testing provides meaningful results related to verifying the control of the given hazard, requiring a preventive control. This test information could be captured in a certificate of analysis, COA, that would be specific to a lot of the raw material or other ingredient. It is important to use methods of analysis that are fit for purpose, the identified hazards, and required preventive controls in place for a specific product will influence the type of sampling and testing to be conducted, e.g., testing finished egg omelet products for salmonella to verify the adequacy of the cooking step, testing for mycotoxins to assure proper nut harvesting and storage practices at the farm level. Testing as part of new supplier approval is usually more extensive than for maintenance of approved supplier status. More details about testing and what information needs to be documented will be discussed in subsequent slides. It is advisable to consult a reference book, e.g. ICM-NSF 2011, FDA BAM, a technical expert or other credible source, see Chapter 10. Process preventive controls for human food, verification, and record keeping, to determine appropriate testing and sampling plans for different types of food products. Examples where testing may be an appropriate verification activity include chemical hazards, such as pesticides, mycotoxins, and heavy metals. In addition to audits and sampling and testing, a review of the supplier's relevant food safety records is another supplier verification activity cited in the regulation. Reviewing the supplier's preventive controls records, such as process CCP, control records, sanitation and allergen preventive control records, and pathogen environmental monitoring records, help to assure the identified hazards were controlled by the supplier. Section 1, 17.415b3, states a receiving facility may not accept a review by its supplier of that supplier's own relevant food safety records as a supplier verification activity. Other activities that may be useful for supplier verification depend on the hazards being managed. Many companies require suppliers to provide a certificate of conformance, which is typically an annual agreement between a supplier and a receiving facility. In this agreement, the supplier provides a statement that the raw materials or other ingredients will fully comply with the requested receiving facility's food safety requirements. Letters of continuing guarantee are annual guarantees certifying that the supplier's raw materials and other ingredients meet company requirements, including legal, regulatory, and conformance to specifications. These certificates generally cover multiple shipments or timeframes and should be reviewed and renewed at least annually, or when requirements change. These generally do not serve as verification activities in the way that audits or testing, e.g., communicated via certificates of analysis, COAs, do, but may be suitable for certain ingredients, such as those with frequent government inspection. Further, they would not be the sole verification activity for compliance with regulatory requirements. Per Section 117.410E, when an audit, verification testing, or other verification activity, relevant consumer, customer, or other complaint or other information identifies a gap in supplier performance related to a hazard requiring a preventive control, the receiving facility must ensure that the food manufactured with the supplier's raw materials or other ingredients is not adulterated or misbranded as a result. Corrective actions will vary depending on the specific issue, as previously discussed in the other chapters on other preventive controls, but a receiving facility must ensure that the appropriate corrective actions were implemented. Note that Section 117.475C16 also requires documentation of actions taken with respect to supplier nonconformance. The FDA Hazard Guide, Chapter 15 recommends that a receiving facility establishes processes and procedures to handle supplier nonconformance situations. The appropriate actions to take in response to nonconformance will depend on the circumstances and the specific root cause of the nonconformance, and could include discontinuing use of the supplier until the cause or causes of nonconformance, adulteration, or misbranding are adequately addressed, notifying the supplier of the problem, and requesting documentation of corrective actions taken by the supplier, assisting the supplier's efforts to correct and prevent recurrence of the problem, revising your supply chain program, and conducting or working with your supplier to conduct a recall of an adulterated or misbranded food. If a supplier issue resulted in adulterated or misbranded products, and those products did enter commerce, then a recall may be required. See Chapter 15. Recall Plan. Corrective action is discussed in other chapters, including documentation requirements in Chapter 10, Process Preventive Controls for Human Food, Verification and Record Keeping. As system failures can occur in the supplier's process or procedures periodically, the supplier must also have a corrective action process for making modifications to prevent reoccurrence of an issue. The receiving facility must ensure that the planned corrective action is actually implemented by the supplier. See Appendix 3 for an example of documenting corrective actions related to supplier nonconformance. It is common industry practice to evaluate the supply chain program on a routine basis, typically annually. Comparing findings from supplier approval, verification, and corrective action processes against the safety requirements in the supplier specifications and purchasing contract is a good starting point for evaluation. The results may indicate the need for a change in suppliers. Using the hazard analysis as a basis, purchasing contracts related to raw material and other ingredient specifications should clearly communicate food safety requirements to the supplier, as well as identify the hazards for the receiving facility's understanding. There are other elements for routine evaluation of the facility's supply chain program. If a food safety issue occurs with a food product, review the supplier program, including verification activities to ensure that program inadequacy was not the cause. For example, the facility may not have identified a hazard that is associated with an ingredient that needed to be controlled by the supplier. Also verify that the supplier took steps to prevent recurrence of issues when applicable. If the facility judges the issues to be serious enough, it could be time to consider changing suppliers. As a result of innovations, the facility or the facility's supplier may create new formulations or new production processes. Any ingredient change should be reviewed to ensure that food safety requirements are still met by the supplier if the ingredient is associated with a hazard requiring a preventive control. Similarly, new hazards are periodically identified to ensure that the facility's supply chain program is adequate to address new hazards associated with the raw material or other ingredient that the supplier provides. This slide outlines common industry practices related to changes that may need to be made related to suppliers. Change is a necessary part of the business process. Having procedures in place to accommodate changes can help avoid food safety or potentially disruptive supply chain issues. Two aspects of change should be considered relative to suppliers. 1. Changes made by the supplier, and 2. Changes made by the receiving facility. If suppliers make a change to the ingredients that they provide, the food safety team should be informed so as to allow reanalysis to determine if changes are needed to the food safety plan or supply chain program. Frequently, supplier communications are handled by purchasing. Thus, the purchasing team must forward relevant information to the food safety team. The supplier must understand the importance of reporting all changes to customers so they can analyze the change with respect to their use of the ingredient. Conversely, the purchasing team may identify a new supplier that can provide a similar ingredient. It is essential that purchasing team members do not make a switch in suppliers of an ingredient or raw material associated with a hazard requiring a supply chain control without the authorization of the food safety team. If new suppliers are necessary, established procedures must be followed. The new supplier must be approved if the ingredient is associated with a hazard requiring a supply chain applied control. Again, it is important to consider the resources needed to review supplier programs for new suppliers from a food safety perspective before switching suppliers. Reanalysis of the food safety plan may also be relevant for supplier changes, especially those for ingredients with hazards requiring a preventive control. Supply chain program required documentation. Regulators, auditors, and customers view records as the historical method for confirming a program is in place and functional. Without records, one cannot demonstrate supplier programs are implemented as designed and are effective in controlling hazards. The records that document the supply chain program are subject to the requirements of Subpart F, the receiving facility's preventive controls. Qualified individual must perform or oversee the review of the records identified in Section 117.475C within the specified time frame to ensure that the records are complete. The activities reflected in the records occurred in accordance with the food safety plan, the supply chain preventive controls are effective, and that appropriate decisions were made about corrective actions. FDA aligned the provisions for supplier verification in the FSVP regulation with the provisions for a supply chain program in 21 CFR Part 117. A receiving facility that is an importer, is in compliance with the FSVP regulation and has documentation of verification activities conducted under 21 CFR 1.506E, does not need to conduct additional supplier verification activities for that raw material or other ingredient. See 21 CFR 117.405(2) for more detail. The receiving facility must maintain documentation of the approval of the facility's suppliers that provide raw materials and other ingredients requiring a supply chain applied control, have written procedures for receiving raw materials and other ingredients, and have records demonstrating use of the written procedures for receiving raw material and other ingredients. Document the determination of the appropriate supplier verification activities the facility will conduct for raw materials and other ingredients requiring a supply chain applied control. Appropriate supplier verification activities include on-site audits, sampling and testing, review of a supplier's relevant food safety records, or other appropriate supplier verification activities. Records of the on-site audits for approved suppliers are required. The audit report must include the supplier's name, audit procedures, the date the audit was conducted, the conclusions of the audit, and corrective actions taken in response to significant deviations identified. Note that the regulation does not require full details of the audit report in its entirety, only the conclusions. Regarding the audit procedure, remember that Regulation Section 117.435B requires that the on-site audit consider applicable food safety regulations and includes a review of the supplier's written plan, e.g., HACCP plan, or other food safety plan, if any, and its implementation for the hazard being controlled. Documentation that demonstrates that the audit was conducted by a qualified auditor is also required, which could be a third-party auditor or a receiving facilities employee. If the employee meets the qualified auditor definition discussed previously. Records of sampling and testing must identify the raw material or other ingredient tested, including the lot number as appropriate and number of samples tested. Identify the tests conducted, including the analytical procedures used, the dates on which the tests were conducted, and the date of the report, the results of the testing, corrective actions taken in response to detection of hazards, and information identifying the laboratory conducting the testing. If the supplier's relevant food safety records are reviewed as a verification activity, then the review of the supplier's records must be documented. Record review is done to ensure that the supplier is following their food safety procedures and producing safe food. It's important to remember a receiving facility may not accept a review by its supplier of that supplier's own relevant food safety records. The documentation of the food safety records review must include the name of the supplier whose records were reviewed, the date of review, the general nature of the records reviewed, the conclusions of the review, and corrective actions taken in response to significant deficiencies identified during the review. Additional supply chain program required documentation includes 10. Documentation of other appropriate supplier verification activities based on the supplier performance and the risk associated with the raw material or other ingredient. Documentation of any determination that verification activities other than an on-site audit and or less frequent on-site auditing of a supplier provide adequate assurance that the hazards are controlled when a hazard in a raw material or other ingredient will be controlled by the supplier and is one for which there is a reasonable probability that exposure to the hazard will result in serious adverse health consequences or death to humans. The following documentation of an alternative verification activity for a supplier that is a qualified facility. I. The written assurance that the supplier is a qualified facility as defined by Section 117.3 before approving the supplier and on an annual basis thereafter. And I. The written assurance that the supplier is producing the raw material or other ingredient in compliance with applicable FDA food safety regulations, or, when applicable, relevant laws, and regulations of the country whose food safety system FDA has officially recognized as comparable or has determined to be equivalent to that of the United States. The following documentation of an alternative verification activity for a supplier that is a farm that supplies a raw material or other ingredient and is not a covered farm under 21 CFR Part 112 of this chapter. I. The written assurance that supplier is not a covered farm under 21 CFR Part 112 of this chapter in accordance with Section 112.4a or in accordance with Section 112.4b and Section 112.5 before approving the supplier and on an annual basis thereafter. And, the written assurance that the farm acknowledges that its food is subject to Section 402 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or, when applicable, that its food is subject to relevant laws and regulations of a country whose food safety system, FDA, has officially recognized as comparable or has determined to be equivalent to that of the United States. The following documentation of an alternative verification activity for a supplier that is a shell egg producer that is not subject to the requirements established in 21 CFR Part 118 of this chapter because it has less than 3,000 laying hens. I. The written assurance that the shell eggs provided by the supplier are not subject to 21 CFR Part 118 of this chapter because the supplier has less than 3,000 laying hens before approving the supplier and on an annual basis thereafter. And the written assurance that the shell egg producer acknowledges that its food is subject to Section 402 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or, when applicable, that its food is subject to relevant laws and regulations of a country whose safety system FDA has officially recognized as comparable or has determined to be equivalent to that of the United States. The written results of an appropriate inspection of the supplier for compliance with applicable FDA food safety regulations by FDA, by representatives of other federal agencies, such as the United States Department of Agriculture, or by representatives from state, local, e.g., county, city, regional, tribal, or territorial agencies, or the Food Safety Authority of another country, when the results of such an inspection is substituted for an on-site audit. Documentation of actions taken with respect to supplier nonconformance. Documentation of verification of a supply chain applied control applied by an entity other than the receiving facility's supplier. 18. When applicable, documentation of the receiving facility's review and assessment of I. Applicable documentation from an entity other than the receiving facility that written procedures for receiving raw materials and other ingredients are being followed. Applicable documentation from an entity other than the receiving facility of the determination of the appropriate supplier verification activities for raw materials and other ingredients. Applicable documentation from an entity other than the receiving facility of conducting the appropriate supplier verification activities for raw materials and other ingredients. IV. Applicable documentation from its supplier of A. The results of sampling and testing conducted by the supplier. Or B. The results of an audit conducted by a third-party qualified auditor in accordance with Section 117.430F and Section 117.435, and applicable documentation from an entity other than the receiving facility of verification activities when a supply chain applied control is applied by an entity other than the receiving facility's supplier. This is an E.g. Food Company example of a supply chain preventive control for refrigerated sliced cheddar cheese and frozen biscuit. The following information is identified: name of the raw material or other ingredient, approved suppliers, name and location, date of approval, hazards requiring a supply chain preventive control applied by the supplier, verification activities, verification procedures, corrective actions, records. Note, the receiving procedure was illustrated in slide 22. In summary, a supplier program is an essential element of a food safety system. The supplier is the entity that manufactures, processes, or grows the food, or raises the animal that the receiving facility uses to manufacture a process as a food product. A supply chain applied control is a preventive control for a hazard in a raw material or other ingredient, when the hazard in the raw material or other ingredient is controlled by the supplier before receipt by the receiving facility. The hazard analysis process identifies hazards requiring a supply chain applied control for which a supply chain program must be implemented. The supply chain program must include using approved suppliers and determining, conducting, and documenting supply chain verification activities. Verification activities may include on-site audits, required for serious hazards unless another approach is justified, sampling and testing, review of a supplier's relevant food safety records, and other activities based on risk. Records that document all of these activities must be maintained to demonstrate that the facility's supplier program is operational and effective. You have completed the lecture for Chapter 13. Be sure to complete the knowledge check as well as the Chapter 13 exercise. See you in Chapter 14.